Delaney, a Maryland 6th district, also the only former CEO of a public traded company currently serving in the House. Congressman, thank you very much for joining us. I know you're on recess. We're sorry we made you put on a tie, but we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
A couple of big issues. You are big in infrastructure.
Yes.
Now, what I have learned so far, just being down here a short time, is that while we all talk about infrastructure like it's a monolith, there's actually a number of different competing plans.
Yep.
Your plan would repatriate corporate tax dollars if they agreed, tax-free, if they agreed to buy into an infrastructure bank.
Right.
How much support do you have for your plan?
So we have a lot of support for that specific plan. We have 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. It's by far the biggest kind of bipartisan infrastructure and tax policy bill in the Congress. And what we do is basically create an opportunity for companies who have cash overseas to repatriate that money back to the United States, provided that they bid in an auction to essentially capitalize a long-term infrastructure bank. So it's taking advantage of the fact that we have now about $2.5 trillion sitting overseas, and we create a pathway for some of that money to come back to the United States, which is good in general, and then we also created an infrastructure bank. Then we have a more comprehensive proposal, right, that is also bipartisan, that fixes the entire international tax system. So it ends deferral, right? It lowers the tax rates to make the rates more competitive. It allows for the money to come back and forth. It generates a fair amount of revenues for the government, which we allocate both towards an infrastructure bank and putting more money in something called the Highway Trust Fund, which funds most of the infrastructure in this country.
And just perpetually underfunded, by the way, because they spend $64 billion a year. They take in about $35 billion a year. You don't need to be a CNBC genius to understand that's not good math. Let's get clearer on your initial plan.
Sure.
And I want to make sure our audience understands what you and others are proposing. And I'll just use Apple as an example because they're the biggest. Apple can bring its money back tax-free, but only if they use some of that in an infrastructure bank.
Right. So the way it works is that we basically have an auction to capitalize infrastructure bank. So we auction off $50 billion of non-government guaranteed 50-year 1% bonds, which creates the equity in a bank, and you can leverage that up 10 to 15 to 1. So it creates $500 billion to $750 billion of financing power. To get companies to buy those bonds, which they never would, no one's going to buy a 50-year 1% subordinate bond that doesn't have a government guarantee. To get them to do that, we say, how many dollars do you need to bring back from overseas tax-free to justify that investment? So we do something called a reverse Dutch auction, where we effectively auction off a ratio. So Apple may bid 5 to 1. So they'll say, we'll put $1 billion in the bank, but we need to bring back $5 billion tax-free to do that.
Okay.
Right, so they conduct this auction, we figure out the clearing price, they sell the $50 billion of bonds.
But the key is the ratio, then.
The key is the ratio.
How much, because I understand your plan, but if you go to companies and say, you need to do this to get that, some people could see that as a little heavy-handed.
Well, they don't have to participate in the auction.
But then they just keep their money overseas.
That's right, which is why we also have the comprehensive plan, right, which basically solves the whole international tax problem.
And where does that take the rate to?
Well, it takes the rate on the money that's over there to 8.75%. So all the money that's sitting overseas, there's a one-time tax, if you will, of 8.75%, and then they can bring the money back and forth. And then on a go-forward basis, new earnings are taxed at it's kind of a sliding scale depending upon how much tax they've paid locally. Call it kind of 12%, 13%, potentially up to as high as 15%. Right, and so, but they can no longer defer.
Would that be an either or then, Congressman? Could they either pay the 8.75% on money overseas or pay zero as long as they invest in the infrastructure bank, or are they separate?
They're two separate proposals, right? The infrastructure bank is a standalone proposal. If we can't get agreement in Congress to fix the entire system, let's do this. It'll create an opportunity for some of the money to come back, right? And it'll create an infrastructure bank. But if we get some courage here and we actually tackle a problem that's really which is international tax, which is causing all kinds of kind of perverse incentives in the way companies do business. And we also want to build infrastructure. We could do a comprehensive fix to the international tax system, create an infrastructure bank, and by the way, put another $120 billion
and you think
in the Highway Trust Fund.
You have the votes?
We have bipartisan support.
On the votes?
Well, it has to be. I believe we have the votes if it gets taken up. The big issue in the Congress has been, will we fix international tax on a standalone basis, or do we have to tie it to comprehensive tax reform? That has been the gating issue. My view is we should fix it on a standalone basis, because there's much more support for doing that. There's bipartisan agreement that it's a problem. We see it every day. We see companies keeping their cash overseas, which is terrible for the U.S. economy. We see inversions, which is terrible for the U.S. economy. All this is because of a bad international tax system, which has nothing to do with the rates that individuals pay in the United States, which is where the ideological issue is.
Before we let you get on with your holiday, Steven Mnuchin, the likely Treasury Secretary, wants to privatize Fannie and Freddie. You have a plan to reform it or, I guess, fix it. What do you think about privatizing it?
Well, I don't know what privatize means. Does that mean the government still...
get the government completely out of Fannie and Freddie?
So that means the government will provide no support to the enterprises. I think that's hard to do, right? So if you think about Fannie and Freddie, right, they've had government support for a long period of time. Everyone has known that the government guarantees their debt, which is why the agency debt typically traded very similar to U.S. Treasuries. That's the U.S. housing market is the second largest fixed income market in the world after the Treasury market. It's hard for me to imagine that we could just turn that over to the private market without any government support to provide liquidity to that market. What I've tried to do is keep the government in the business of providing liquidity to the market, but get it out of the business of pricing the risk. So we have a bill that is comprehensive reform that has a lot of risk sharing, but allows the government to continue to provide liquidity. When he says he wants to privatize it, I'm not sure what that means. If he wants to completely turn it over to the private market, I don't think it's going to work.
I guess we'll find out after January 20th.